and a warm welcome to the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore for the fourth lecture of the 2023's Middle East 101 lecture series. At this point, we are at the midpoint of this year's ME101. In the first three lectures, we discussed the geopolitical competition in the region, its background, and recent developments. In the remaining lectures, we will be shifting our focus to the economic and social challenges faced by the countries within the region. To kick off the second part, we begin by looking at climate change in a desert. With us today to put us in the picture of what this means exactly is Dr. Aisha Al-Sahiri, who is a research fellow at MEI and our climate change expert. Dr. Al-Sahiri is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs and the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Her expertise encompasses political economy, geopolitics, policy and governance of energy, climate, and the environment, focusing on the Middle East. Dr. Al-Sahiri's research has been featured in different international media outlets such as Reuters, the Associated Press, Arab News, and the Asian Times. With extensive working experience in Riyadh, London, and Washington, coupled with several publications, including the Renewable Energy and Climate Policy Journal, you can be assured that whether you're familiar with the issues or a newcomer to the subject, today's lecture will offer a clear overview with fresh insights. With that said, Aisha, please.
Pleasure to be with you here today. And as Misha mentioned, I will speak about, or I will cover the climate change issue in the Middle East. And for today's lecture, it will have two main objectives. The first objective is how the Middle East is impacted by the climate change. And the second objective would be on how the Middle East have been addressing the issue of the climate change. Before delving into these objectives, first I will give a brief background about the Middle East, and secondly, or at the end, I will highlight on why should Singapore care about the climate dynamics in the Middle East. So as a brief background for those, I'm sure like everyone is familiar where the Middle East is. But the Middle East, due to the geographic location, it has an arid and semi-arid climate conditions. The population in the region has been continuously increasing, as we see in the second figure, the figure with the trend in the green. And the Middle East, although the countries in the region face common socio-economic and environmental challenges, you can actually see there's a disparity, a vast disparity of security and wealth across the countries in the region. There are the fragile, the least unstable, politically stable countries, like Iraq, Syria, Iran, but there are also the emerging economies, as well as the most wealthiest countries in per capita basis, which are the Gulf Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, and Qatar. So with that, I mentioned those important facts about the Middle East because these interact pretty much with what is going on when we speak about the climate change. So going to the first objective, how is the Middle East is impacted by the climate change? Now I'm going to expand on the different aspects of the issue. First of all, the rising temperature. As we already noticed, July, the last July has been confirmed as the hottest month on Earth. And many countries in the Northern Hemisphere has experienced extreme heat events, including China, North America, but also for the Middle East, the highest records of the temperature has been experienced in the Gulf region. 66 degrees Celsius have been recorded. And for Iran, there was a 2-day shutdown, holiday, because of the extreme heat. And that is mainly because for Iran, Iran depends on the hydropower for the electricity generation. And so because of the heat, there was, shortages on the water that is needed for generation of the electricity. And that led to a 2-day shutdown in Iran. In terms of climate change, climate models suggest that the already hot region the temperature will continue to increase towards the mid and the end of the century. The region is, compared to other parts of the world, is heating as twice faster, and it could heat in a worst case scenario by almost 5 degrees Celsius. And this is much higher than the global target to limit the rise in the temperature by 2 degrees Celsius. Also, for a region that has an arid and semi-arid climate conditions, climate change is also affecting the rainfall patterns in the region. Generally speaking, the region will experience a reduced amount of the rainfall as we by the mid or by the end of the century, but also the region will experience fluctuations on the rainfall. So sometimes we see there are times when there is a huge concentration of the rainfall in the region, and that of course is going to affect the economies for the countries in the region, especially for countries that depends on the agriculture as a main source of income. And I'm going to highlight on that more in the next slides. But before going into that, water scarcity is a major challenge for the countries, for the Middle East countries. The World Resource Institute last month has released data, ranking the countries that are experiencing extreme water stress. And there was a list of 25 countries, but the majority of these countries are in the Middle East. And as you see in the figure, the extreme high of the water stress is highlighted in dark red or lighter red, and that is mostly seen in the Middle East. What is also important to mention when it comes to the water scarcity, the implications of the water scarcity will not be experienced within country borders, but also because the water resources are shared between, especially for surface water basins, are shared between countries in the region. There could be regional, climate change could bring regional security issues around the water resources. And for the region, there are 5 main surface water basins where the water is shared between countries. An example is the Nile River, which is shared between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. And we have already seen, especially over the last few months, some kind of tension between Ethiopia and Egypt, where Egypt tried to take the side of Sudan, but Sudan is in the middle, so it is in a rock and hard position where to choose a side. But because climate change, cause an increase on the temperature, but also causing the problem of the water scarcity on the riparian countries, it actually affects the flow of the water to the downstream countries, And this is why it can create issues not only on the Nile, but also in other basins like the Tigris and Euphrates. So Iraq, for example, is depending on the water resources that comes from Iran, as well as from Turkey. So it has been greatly affected by the developments in Iran and in Turkey, especially the development of the dam, the water dams in these countries, which affect the flow of the water. So Iraq is in a really difficult position and trying to be very diplomatic with both Iran and Turkey. Similar issue can be seen around the Jordan River Basin and Senegal River Basin as well. So for some other countries, also they share the groundwater resource, the aquifers. So there are 41 shared aquifers also. An example of this is the Jordan, the water system between Jordan and Syria. And then there's also the water system that's shared between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And these are, because of the decline or the peak management of the water resources, it really affects the amount of the water in those aquifers, and it creates kind of tensions between countries on who has the right to have the control of the water resources. So also another important factor to look at when it comes to the climate change in the region is the impact of the climate change on the human security. So as I mentioned in my earlier slides, there's a scarcity of water, but also because of the climate change, there are also events of high concentration of water, which cause either floods or cyclones. And unfortunately, these events cause human death. An example is the tropical cyclone that hit Oman back in 2007. And also water shortages. The example of the water shortages in Iran, for many occasions, they have triggered protests in Iran. And that is, as I mentioned, because of the blackout of electricity. And that is mainly because of the water shortages. I also, in the middle picture, I brought the example of the Ethiopian resonance dam, which create tension, as I mentioned, between Sudan and between Ethiopia and Egypt. Another important also element to look at when it comes to the climate change is the food security challenge. Now, because of the climatic conditions in the region is already hot. The water scarcity is already a challenge for the region. So there's a limited scope for enhancing the agriculture in the region, although the agriculture sector is somehow active in some countries. So for that reason, many countries in the region depend on the import of food. The import of food accounts between 80 to 90% for some countries, especially for the Gulf countries. So climate change, even if it doesn't, it's going to affect the countries in the Middle East region. But in terms of the food security, what happens in other parts of the world when climate change affects the agriculture productivity, it's actually going to affect the supply chain for food, and eventually would affect the Middle Eastern countries. We can think of example of the Russia-Ukraine war and how that affected the exportation of the wheat. And also during the COVID-19 period, when there was measurements to confine the virus, there was also effects on the supply chain of food. and countries have been affected. Climate change could bring similar challenges if not addressed properly. And also climate change for countries that depends on the agriculture sector, like Algeria, Egypt, Iran, and Morocco. It could affect the agriculture productivity, which can decline by 60% by 2050. It also, there is an argument that the protest in Syria in 2011 has been caused by the climate change. But for some scholars, it is not only climate change, but the interaction of climate change, especially the drought period that took place between 2006 and 2010 has been a major factor for making a drop in the crop yields in Syria, and eventually the protests that we have seen in the country. Sea level rise is another challenge for the Middle East countries, especially for the Gulf countries. Why? Because 90% of the population in these countries live in cities, and most of these cities are actually located on the coastline. And it is not only the people who live on the cities, but most of the infrastructure like transportation, the power plants, the desalination plants, the ports, and as well as the oil and gas export facilities. All of them are mostly concentrated on the coastline. So the sea level rise is expected for the region to increase between 0.2 and 0.5 meters by the mid of the century. But also because there is this heavy infrastructure on the coast, that can also lead to a subside of the land. So combined with the sea level rise, actually many countries in the region could lose permanently a big chunk of the land. But for Bahrain, because it's a small island, some studies suggest that if the sea level rise by 1 meter, Bahrain can disappear. Right. Also, the region, although it is a hot and it also experiences events of high concentration of rainfall in a short period of time, and that is an interaction with the not ready infrastructure to absorb water. It creates flash floods, and this is has been experienced frequently in the region. I give some example from Jeddah. Jeddah has been frequently affected by the flash floods in 2009, 2011, and 2020, and it caused hundreds of deaths, especially in 2009. And another extreme weather event is the exposure of the region to the tropical cyclones. And Oman, because Oman is in the coastline of the Arabian Sea, there has been frequent events of cyclones. At least 4 cyclones have been registered in the last 12 years alone. And because of the climate change, the frequency, the intensity of these cyclones has been becoming more and more bigger. And Cyclone Gono has been, the strongest so far. Back in 2007, it killed around 100 people, but it also caused a damage of infrastructure of around $4 billion. Cyclone Shaheen happened 2 years ago in 2021, and it also has a great deal of infrastructure damage of around 500 million US dollar. Also, another major implication of climate change is the dust storms. Because the region has, desertic climate conditions, and because the temperatures are increasing, the water resources are drying up because of the increase in the evaporation. These factors actually leading to the degradation of the soil, and that leads to increasing the incidence of dust and sandstorms across the region. So these the pictures you see here are recent examples of sandstorms in Kuwait and in Iraq, but Iran also experiencing the sandstorms more frequently. And sandstorms do not have like only human health impacts, but they have also economic impacts because they create damage to buildings, to the power lines, the crops, and also like to the daily life. It reduces the visibility. So it causes the shutdown of schools, public offices, and in the case of the dust storm in Iraq in 22 last year, also that led to shutdown of the airspaces and flights have been canceled. Also because dust storms are, like it doesn't happen within the boundary of the country, but they are transboundary in nature. So it starts in one country, but it also flows to the other countries, neighboring countries. So it has over the time created geopolitical tension between countries, especially between Iran and the regional countries like Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. In some occasions, Iran would blame Turkey for building the dams, which affect the water flow to Syria and Iraq, and again, the degradation of the soil and the occurrence of the sandstorms in these countries. Okay, at the beginning I mentioned the Gulf Arab countries are the wealthiest in the region because they host around 1/3 of the oil reserves and around the quarter of the global gas reserves. And because of that, the economies of these countries have been pretty much structured around the oil and gas revenues. I'm showing here the revenues from the oil and gas account for more than 80% for some countries, for example, for Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar, of the total revenues. And they also they dominate the export portfolio for those countries. And for that specific reason, any decline on the demand for the oil and gas, or any implications to the oil prices, would translate in negative economic outlook for the region. And this is why, for example, the OPEC has been created. It has been created to stabilize the market, especially when the market is experiencing low oil prices. So for the global community, especially since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, the global community are trying to reduce the dependence on the hydrocarbons and cut greenhouse gas emissions as much as possible, to reach net zero by the mid of the century. And if we look at the energy consumption today, it is mostly dominated by the oil and gas, which accounts for 80%, around 80%. To tackle the climate change, moving in the future, we need to flip the game. So we need to decrease the dependence on the hydrocarbons, where the dependence on the hydrocarbons become 20%, and the rest of the energy supply and consumption comes from cleaner energy resources such as renewables. So what I'm showing here in the figure is the trade partners for the Gulf countries, which are the EU, the Japan, India, China. And most of the trade partners are now taking strides to address the climate change, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and most of these ambitions, try to reduce the dependence on the fossil fuels. And there are some models out there that try to look at the outlook of the oil demand on the future and how could that affect the oil consumption so that we can tackle the issue of the climate change. So for the Gulf, or for generally speaking, for the oil-producing countries, this is a very big concern because most of the energy outlook out there emphasize a reduction on the demand of the fossil fuels. And also they calculate how much of the rent can be lost in advanced climate policy scenarios. So these are the most challenges that I wanted to cover. There are some other challenges, but because of the time, I'm gonna move to the speaking about how the Middle East tackle the issue of the climate change. So first of all, the Middle East countries are well aware of the climate change challenges, and this is why they are engaged on the international climate regime. They have, joined the Paris Agreement. The majority of them ratified the Paris Agreement. But what is so important is actually to look at how they are involved in addressing the impacts of the climate change, at home. So just to, in this big table, you don't need to look at everything, but the idea is to show that the countries in the region, do have the political will to address the climate change. That is why they have established the institutions to address climate change. And they have set targets, for example, the renewable energy targets and the net zero targets. But they have also, some of them has established strategies on how to mitigate and adapt to the climate change. A quick example is for the UAE. The UAE is one of the first countries to establish a green growth strategy where it tries to address the climate change issues along with the development plans. But again, what is so important is the implementation of those strategies and the targets. So if we look at the how the countries are trying to deal with the climate change issues, we spoke at the beginning about the high temperature. So cooling, especially for the Gulf countries, have had long experience with cooling. Because the temperature there without cooling, it's unbearable. But cooling is actually accounting for about 70% of the electricity consumption in the region. And the electricity consumption is one of the most highest on per capita basis in the Gulf country. And this trend, because of climate change is making the region is more hot, is going also to increase. More cooling will be needed in the future, and that means more electricity also will be needed. And oil and gas has been the main source for electricity generation in the region. What I also want to say that these factors that I am speaking about, they are pretty much interlinked with one another. So economic development is also connected with the climate change. Also in terms of the water scarcity, I mean, the countries in the Middle East still depend on the surface water, like the rivers, as well as groundwater. But because of the weak management of the water and the high rates of the consumption, these resources are, and also because of reduced amount of the rainfall, these resources are not sustainable in the long term. So one of the solutions is to build the desalination plants. So the Middle East at the moment account for more than 53% of the desalination that takes place globally. And there's more and more desalination projects are built in the region. And the World Energy Outlook expect a 14-fold increase of the desalination by 2040. Another way also that, especially for the Gulf region, on finding an alternative source of water is the cloud seeding. The UAE has been investing a lot in the cloud seeding, but also Saudi Arabia is investigating this technology as well. Wastewater, the reuse of the wastewater. So the region is also trying to clean up the wastewater and reuse it. But the current reuse, unlike here in Singapore, the reused water can be used for drinking, but in the region, it is mostly used for the agriculture and the landscape irrigation. And also because I mentioned there are some regional climate issues around the water. The countries in the region, from a government point of view, are aware of those kind of challenges, and this is why they have established different institutions to look at these issues, including the Arab Ministerial Water Council in the Arab League, the Ministerial Water and Electricity Cooperation Committee under the Gulf Cooperation Council. ESCWA is also involved in many regional water management in the region. And then there is the Middle East Desalination Research Center, MIDRC, which is based in Oman. It conducts research and training for the shared water resources and the desalination. And also there are some other regional institutions that have been developed across the region. The most recent of which is the Middle East Green Initiative that was established in 2021. And it has many ambitions to address the different climate issues that we spoke about, including in the area of cloud seeding, in the area of tackling the dust storms through the early weather warning of storms. However, if we looked at these regional institutions, and my colleague and we conducted a study back in 2019, most of these institutions have a historical record of being really weak, and they barely have implementation or climate action orientation. So the strategies are not clear on how these initiatives could achieve the ambitions that have been set. In terms of the food security, just so briefly, as I mentioned, the scope for enhancing the agriculture is very limited. So some countries, such as the UAE, is looking at the vertical farming and the food tech. Aquaculture is also a major industry to enhance food security across the region. Also, the Middle East country realize the importance to engage with the energy transition. So they invest on the renewable energy. The renewable energy installed capacity has increased in the region over the past decade or so. Although as of today, the oil and gas continue to contribute, about 90% of the energy needs are met through the oil and gas. For the Gulf countries, just to give a perspective and a comparison between countries and who is investing more in renewable energy, the UAE is leading compared to the other Gulf. But as we see over the past decade, there has been an increase in the renewable energy installed capacity. Also, the national oil companies across the region are taking, role in setting net zero targets. ADNOC have set a net zero target by actually 2045. The 2050 has been revised. The Oman-based BDO also have set a net zero target, as well as Saudi Aramco, because especially for the Gulf countries, they understand the importance of diversifying the energy resources, as well as diversifying the economies and the importance of reducing the dependence on the hydrocarbon. But of course, this is a very challenging task for the Gulf countries. Also, we have seen there is a hype on the hydrogen development, especially for the Gulf Arab states. There are several projects in the pipeline, and some of them are expected to be operational by the end of this year. Also, the countries in the region have been involved in climate diplomacy. The host, we have 4 countries so far has hosted the COP over the last few years: Morocco, Qatar, and Egypt. And this year, COP28 will be hosted in the UAE. So from a researcher perspective, is whether the host of these COPs, will enhance or advance the implementation of climate policies in the region. But we wait and see. This is my last slide because the UAE is hosting the COP this year. The question is whether the UAE is taking a role to reflect on the regional climate issues that face the Middle East. If we look at the COP28 agenda, there are elements that look at the food security, the water scarcity and security, but also at the peace and security in the region. What I'm showing here in this slide is the formal agenda that would be discussed during COP28, because the UAE is a hydrocarbon rich country. It is under pressure also to play a leading role in facing down the fossil fuels. Over the last few months, since the announcement of the UAE as a COP host, there has been a great deal of criticism on the UAE approach toward the hydrocarbon. So the phase down of the fossil fuel will be a major agenda that would be discussed during the COP. Already the European countries are campaigning for a phase out, but not a phase down of the fossil fuels. So this is putting a kind of a pressure for the UAE and the regional oil-producing countries. If there's a question of whether the scope will be a game changer, the hope that the UAE will be the first, the COP28 in the UAE will be the first COP to take a stock on the country's progress towards climate change. It will be the first time the progress of the countries will be assessed, and this is creating a hope that this would create some pressure on the countries to advance their climate policies. Yes, I forgot, like I have the slide on Singapore, but this is my last slide. Since we are speaking here in Singapore, the question is why Singapore should care about the dynamics in the Middle East when it comes to the climate change. Singapore depends on around 36% of its fuel imports on the Middle East. And as I mentioned, UAE is hosting the COP this year, so it's the hope also it will be an Asia COP reflecting not only the Middle East concerns, but concerns in Asia, which is part of the global South. So these countries would have similar challenges when it comes to climate and energy. But also the two regions have, kind of similar aspirations when it comes to the energy transition, as well as they have common climate challenges, including the water security, the sea level rise, as well as the exposure to extreme weather events. So with that, I leave you with those pictures from the region that I took them during my stay in the Gulf for the last few years. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions.
Well, thank you so much for that. And those nice pictures. So now we move on to the next, and I think everybody's favorite part of the lecture, the question and answer. For those in the audience, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. For those of you online, please send your questions via Zoom and I will read them out. Now, if I may ask the first question, linking it back to the first part of our lecture series on geopolitical competition, as Gulf countries strive in their climate action plans and things like that, do you see it as a driver or of cooperation or of competition between them in the region?
For the countries within the region?
Within the region.
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. From historical perspective, we have seen that there isn't much of a cooperation. This is why we see there are still environmental and climate-related issues, especially over shared water resources. However, as I mentioned, there is the governments in the region understand the importance of cooperation. As I mentioned also, there's these institutions that have been established have been weak in terms of achieving the objectives because there is no, somehow it is because of the data, so sometimes it's because of the human capacity that is needed to address those challenges. However, I also see more of a competition coming up, especially as countries address the issue of the climate change. Because my expertise, my core expertise is focused on the Gulf, oil-producing Gulf countries. I can see, especially in the area of the energy transition, more of a competition in developing the renewable, the hydrogen, because these countries are in position to create a competitive advantage as they transition away from the hydrocarbon, but also as they make their own energy transition. So for the hydrogen, for renewable, I can see more of a competition, but not much of working together. Although there is the GCC electricity grid that has been established, I think back in 1980s. It is still like I think it's only 5% operational in terms of the trading the electricity between countries. So it is not fully operational. So this is also another indication we see more of competition than cooperation.
Oh, thank you. Something for them to think about, I suspect. All right. Any questions from the floor?
Yes. So Jean-Luc Saman from the Middle East Institute. My question relates to your view, Aisha, on the challenge of reforms for political stability, especially in the Gulf, because, for instance, in Europe, in principle, the citizens are supporting reforms for climate change, but some of the reforms introduce new taxes or cuts in the subsidies, and that's the moment where things get more complex. In France, the Yellow Jacket movement was created after the introduction of a tax that was aiming at reforms for climate change. So in the Gulf, I was wondering, how do you see the potential, especially in countries which heavily rely on subsidies? So for water consumption, for oil and gas, how do you think that the Gulf states can manage that, not just in terms of the economic reforms, but how can they make sure that the citizens are aware of the challenges ahead?
Well, that's very good question. Thank you very much, Jean-Luc. Well, it is a very important issue to look at, is the socio-economic implications of climate action. So it's not only the climate change impacts, but also advancing climate policies in the region could have negative implications, as you mentioned, similar maybe to protests in France. For the Gulf countries, because there's a social contract, where most of the services, as you mentioned, the water and the electricity, are heavily subsidized. So to advance climate policy, especially when it comes to the area of the energy transition, enhancing the competition of renewable energy, we will need to make the cost of renewable energy competitive to that of the fossil fuel services. And for the Gulf countries, the electricity services, because they are heavily subsidized, it is very cheap. So it doesn't create more room for renewable energy to be competitive. And so to advance climate policies and to enhance the integration of renewables, what is important is to reform the energy subsidies, so that we can make the renewables more competitive. And that, of course, is going to affect the social contract between the state and the citizens. And actually, looking back, it is not pretty much a new subject, especially for the Gulf countries, where I look very closely. There has been some energy price reforms in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia and Oman, and that happened not because of climate drivers, but because of economic drivers. They happened when the oil prices have dropped in 2014. So in Saudi Arabia, we saw 2 times of the price, actually in 2014, and also during the financial crisis, 2008. So we have seen energy price reforms. And again, it is about the human capacity on how to do it. And your question is how to avoid the negative implications. So at the beginning, we have seen some mild of a protest in some countries in the region because of the increase of the fuel prices as well as the electricity prices. But with the experience, I can give the example of Saudi Arabia. They have introduced the citizen account. So the low income groups will be, receiving cash to compensate for the high fuel and electricity prices. But of course, for the middle income groups, they can afford it. So they don't receive any kind of compensation. So I think this kind of, learning process can be applied moving forward when advancing climate policies. I hope, yeah.
We have another question from the audience.
Thank you so much, Misha. Thank you, Aisha, for that wonderful presentation. You have mentioned about the Paris Agreement. I think the epochal development in terms of checking the climate problem. Iran has not ratified it, right? And it is it's rated as the 6th largest greenhouse gas emitter. In terms of hydrocarbon equivalent gas and oil, it is the largest repository. And it says that because the US sanctions, it has not been ratifying it. Now you understand the problem that's being created and the problem that small island nations like Singapore, Seychelles, Maldives. So would you advocate, given this kind of problem, global problem, would you advocate the lifting of sanctions, US sanctions from Iran to save the world from this climate problem? Or would you advocate adhering to the concerns of the regional countries emanating from Iran's nuclear program? Which one would you advocate? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a very difficult question. But sanctions, when sanctions are put on the country, it reduces the chances for the country to attract the foreign investments. And for Iran, which I'm not pretty much an expert on, but for Iran, because of the sanctions, the country needs to depend and consume its hydrocarbon resources for the electricity production and for also running its own industries. And for Iran, we see it is not only the dust storms, but they have those periods of air pollution because of the consumptions of the oil and gas locally. So in this way, the sanction is counterproductive when it comes to addressing climate change issues. And for Iran, of course, it would not ratify the Paris Agreement, because if the sanction continue, it will be under kind of obligation to also transition away from its own hydrocarbon resources. This is why Iran didn't want to ratify the Paris Agreement. So it is perhaps more of employing the science to understand whether from climate perspective this is a good or a bad thing. For me, I think it's a bad thing.
All right. We have another question from the audience, and after that, I think we'll take 1 or 2 questions from our online audience. Please.
Yeah, my name is Jin Sok from Energy Studies Institute. You've mentioned the price competitiveness of renewables, and it's more expensive, and it is hindering the development of renewable energy in the Middle East. And in many areas, renewables are more expensive, but in some area also it's sometimes solar is cheaper. But could you elaborate how much more the renewables are expensive in comparison with the existing traditional fuels? That the differences gap is very big, or can be overcome? It can be overcome or something like that.
Okay, great question. Thank you very much. Okay, so I don't have the exact figures. I have done some research back in 2017, and then I didn't update myself on that. However, what I know for sure, that still, like, despite the energy policy reforms that took place in some countries, still the access to the electricity services is more cheaper than opting for renewable energy, which maybe is not the cost of the production, but also the capital cost of renewable energy. In terms of how different the sectors are, I'm afraid also, like, I don't have the exact numbers for that.
Well, actually, we have a question online that is somewhat related to the previous question. Given that it was mentioned that these Gulf countries have economies structured around oil and gas, and that the current climate mitigation measures will have some sort of impact on their own incomes and revenues from the oil and gas industry, because it will reduce demand. What sort of continuity of economy measures do these countries have for the future? Are they making plans to shield themselves from the loss of revenue?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question, and valid question, actually. Can be complicated. But yes, this is a concern that the oil-producing countries in the region are looking at very closely, and this is why we see the countries in the region are, deploying economic diversification measures to reduce the dependence on a single source of income, which is at the moment either the oil or the gas. So the way the Gulf countries are trying to diversify is to increase the role of the private sector, create programs that create opportunities for the small, medium enterprises, and also to invest very largely on the sovereign wealth fund, so they can benefit in the meantime on the revenues that comes from the oil and gas. So for some countries like Saudi Arabia, the public investment fund is also trying to diversify its investment and not only focused on the traditional hydrocarbon sector, but also to invest in emerging sectors like electric vehicles. They had an agreement with Lucid, some shares with the Lucid company, and also to invest on the tourism sector, as well as investing in the education, so they can strengthen the human capacity in the country. That said, I said it is complicated because with the climate change impact, the outlook of the climate change impacts is also bringing complications on all of those kind of investments moving forward, especially, for example, if we look at the tourism sector, the high temperature is, for example, is going to reduce the period for the tourists to come to the region, because for the region, the summer, it is two seasons, summer and winter. The winter is, the temperature is not as low as if you go to Europe, but the winter is around 4 months. But with the climate change, maybe these 4 months are going also to become 3 months. And then also because most of the investments taking place around the coastal lines, they are also can be affected by the sea level rise. We see some big projects, investments taking place across the countries. A major example is the NEOM, a project in the Red Sea, which strive to be a carbon neutral project that runs mainly on renewable energy, and also where the country strive to develop most of the hydrogen plants there and to make it food independent project. Well, it is, there are some trials in the region to diversify, but again, I think it's too important to factor in the implications of climate change and how are they going to affect those investments in the long term.
All right, thank you. We have another question online. It is linked to something you said in your presentation. At one point you said the UAE is leading in renewable energy conversion.
Yeah.
So the question is, which country is most advanced in climate action overall in the region? And what makes them the most advanced in climate action?
Okay, so it's not easy maybe to compare because the countries in the region have different size of economies, different size of natural resources, as well as a size of the population. So it's as well as a different size of wealth that is needed to invest. But looking at who have maybe invested or advanced their investments on the climate-related projects, from my research, I think the UAE is more advanced because the UAE is not only investing on renewable energy, but also is more advanced when it comes to the economic diversification. Although the hydrocarbons are contributing heavily to the country income, but they managed to develop new economic sectors, especially, for example, in the real estate, tourism, the logistic, but they are also more advanced on enabling the private sector and the small, medium enterprises. And also as the countries in the region strive to develop a knowledge-based economy, the UAE, although the localization of the technology is not contributing much to the export, but it is more advanced compared to the other countries.
Okay,
So,
thank you. Are there any more questions from the audience here?
Hi, Yuhan. So I just want to ask, with there being talks between US, Israel and Saudi Arabia, whereby there's going to be improvement in relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, where there's going to be there might be an eventual recognition of Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel as an official state. How do you think this will affect the dynamics of the Gulf and Middle Eastern countries, and how do you think this will impact efforts towards alleviating climate change, by the Gulf and Middle Eastern countries?
Can you repeat the question again, please?
Sorry, just say again. So, with there being talks between US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia to improve, relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, where there's going to be there might be an eventual recognition of Israel by Saudi Arabia. How do you think this will impact the dynamics of the Gulf and the Middle Eastern countries, and how will this then impact the efforts towards tackling climate change?
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, Jan-Lov can answer this question. Oh, right. Well, actually, what we can look at the moment, the relation between Saudi Arabia and Iran At least it's getting better since the last agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so in terms of enhancing regional climate action and cooperation, this can bring hopes in terms of advancing the cooperation between the GCC and Iran. In terms of Israel, although the normalization with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, may be not going to happen anytime soon. However, Israel and other Gulf countries, such as the UAE, are working closely together in several issues, including in the area of the climate and the energy transition. There is the UAE has been involved in an initiative between Israel and Jordan, where Jordan produced the solar energy, and Israel is producing desalinated water, and they trade in the exchange for energy for water. So if Saudi Arabia also normalize with Israel, we can see more of cooperation between countries. In Israel, actually, Israel is more advanced compared to the Gulf countries when it comes to the innovation, when it comes also to the investment in the water desalination. And so that can create also more avenues for the both sides to learn from one another, rather than just excluding one another. I hope I addressed, but thanks for coming.
We have a few questions online asking similar questions, so I'll try and amalgamate these questions into one question. You answered a little bit of it with Jean-Luc's first question. But overall, other than a bit of backlash from people unhappy with oil prices rising and things like that for local consumers, what do the people on the ground in Middle East countries feel about climate change? Is there a sense of urgency? Are there grassroots efforts to address it? Are the youth getting involved? And is there a religious and cultural dimension to tackling climate change specifically in the Gulf region?
Okay. Right. So the youth in the Gulf region, you said? No. Okay. Okay. So the youth accounts for a big chunk of the population in the Middle East in general. They account for around 1/3 of the population are between 15 and 30 years old. And so this generation will be the most impacted by the implications of climate change that we experience today, but we will experience in the future. In terms of their engagement with the climate issues, at the moment, because of the current political structures, the youth, there is a small scope for engagement when it comes to the youth involvement. However, there are some small groups of youth movements in the region. And the UAE, the host of the COP28 this year, is actually also creating the platform for the youth to come together and then to also voice out their concerns during the COP. But again, in terms of the implication, the scope is limited. And also another thing is to what extent the young generation are aware of the impacts of the climate change. Now also the Middle East is one of the most regions in the world that has access to the social media platforms. So in that way, the social media platforms providing the education around climate, whether the positive or the negative education about climate change, but also, as I mentioned, the governments also do understand the importance of raising the awareness about climate issues. So slowly, some of the governments are integrating the climate science in the education curricula. It is happening in Oman and in the UAE, as far as I know. So I hope I did answer the question.
Oh, yes, thank you. And with, as you mentioned, with COP28, bringing in the youths, you also talked about how there would be a game changer because this would be the first COP that requires the countries to report on the progress.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how easy or what difficulties do you think you foresee in enforcing this and actually implementing these progress reports, open and honest reporting from participating countries?
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's a really good question because when it comes to the Paris Agreement, although it is a legally binding agreement, yet the country's action on climate remains voluntary, because if country doesn't meet its climate ambitions that are outlined in the nationally determined contributions, then there is no kind of taken to the country to a court and say, you have to do more. It is more of, the Paris Agreement is taken more of enhancing the voluntary climate action. So it is the global stocktake when it takes place, because there will be a measure of the country's progress, and this, what also Paris Agreement is doing, is to enhance the transparency in the reporting. So that measurement of the progress will be put online, so everyone can look at it. So the way that we are hoping we will see more of action, because we will see, pointing of fingers, which can create a pressure on countries. So, yeah.
Right. Well, fingers crossed on that front. We have another question online, and I think this one is related to your last slide, the one about Singapore. They're asking if Singapore is selling any equipment or expertise on dealing with water security issues to Middle East countries.
It's a very good question. I haven't looked at it very closely, so I might not have an answer. But what I know, Singapore has a free trade agreement with the Gulf countries. And then there has been a sign of memorandum of understanding between the two sides in the area of renewable energy, for example, on the hydrogen. And probably, because I don't know, but probably on the water.
Well, thank you for that. And potentially, we have the contact details of that person. We could email them, reach out later on when we do have an answer.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
One of the projects you mentioned just now, in the works of diversification of their economy in Saudi Arabia, the NEOM project, one of the flagship projects, which is the line, it seems like a rather futuristic and very high technological project. And how do you think developments of this project will be? Do you think it's feasible to carry out the whole project, or will the project be aborted in years to come?
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, this is the line project aspires to be a sustainable project, and it is a $5 billion US dollar project. At the moment, the finance of the project will depend on the revenues that comes from the export of the oil. Now, if we don't speak about the impacts of the climate change, the fluctuations of the oil prices have already affected the progress on investing on the project. There were times after COVID, the project was not a priority for the government because the government wanted to focus on the health sector also, as well as the economic recovery from COVID. So it is very ambitious from my point of view. And speaking about it from climate perspective, also as countries progress on their climate action, maybe we see a peak on the demand for the oil, and then that could potentially affect also the revenues that comes from the project. But the project is very, is multifaceted. If we want to assess its sustainability, the building of the project might depend on the hydrocarbon resources. So that is, in a way, is not really sustainable, but maybe the outcome would be sustainable. It would pretty much depend on the designing of the project. For example, it is a hot environment, so the design needs to be very clever in how to enable the project to cool itself. So that is the aspiration behind it, but also not too many people live in the region at the moment, so it would also require bringing people to that specific. And the line, the structure of it is the saline. So it would also depend on the people preferences to live in such an environment. Maybe people would want to go and visit, but to live there, I'm not exactly sure. But thanks. It's a difficult question that I wish I could have an answer for.
Thank you.
And with that final answer, I think we unfortunately are drawing to the end of our time today. Thank you so much, Aisha, for informative lecture. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm certain I'm not alone. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us here in person or online. Please return next week, same time, same place, for our lecture on the changing Gulf, a look at domestic policies and social reforms delivered by another one of our colleagues, Dr. Clemens Che. Good evening and take care.